The Canadian housing market, and indeed the global housing market, has been surprisingly strong so far through COVID-19. It really has been a revelation, the strength that we've seen in home prices and resales and in activity more generally really hasn't missed a beat. And if anything, it's stronger than it was perhaps before COVID-19 came along. And so certainly a wonderful thing for those benefiting from a stronger housing market. I will say, however, there have been some shifts in terms of preferences, as you might imagine. And so, for instance, low density enjoying more of a boost than high density housing. And so apartments and condos not quite as attractive or not rising in attractiveness to the extent that we've seen suburban and maybe rural living rise. And so that's one twist and one differentiator across the housing market. But I will say this, we still think there is a risk of somewhat softer housing over the coming year and beyond. And it's hard to escape that conclusion just looking at the facts on the ground. And so here we are in a world in which the unemployment rate is the highest it's been in several decades. And so that's a smaller pool of people capable of buying a home. And it's also a pool of people perhaps more at risk of losing their home as well. And so that's a challenge. Immigration has ground virtually to a halt. And even with optimistic assumptions that it begins to restart in 2021 and beyond, that's significantly less demand for housing. Let's keep in mind the bulk of population growth in much of the developed world is immigration. Without that, you don't actually need a whole lot of new houses, and that changes the supply-demand dynamic quite significantly. And then the Canadian example specifically, of course, we went into this pandemic with high household debt levels, and we've seen Canadians defer their mortgage payments at about twice the rate as in the US. And so there is some vulnerability on the household debt side in particular. And then a few other smaller thoughts, like as students often pursue university now virtually, fewer apartments needed by students, as people travel less, Airbnb and these sorts of secondary short-term uses for apartments and condos have diminished as well. And so the bottom line is it makes sense to us that there should be somewhat softer demand out there for housing. I'm not convinced we can see the sorts of rapid gains that have dominated the first 6 months of the pandemic. To be clear equally, though, not calling for any kind of crash. This is a story in which perhaps some of the enthusiasm has to slow over time, and we may see a little bit of pain a bit later.